Howdy of you delicious people, I'm here today to review the Wandavision episode, the more current one. I don't remember which number it is, because ultimately, bath salts. No, if any, we'll have it on the thumbnail. We'll have it on the title. We'll let you know. I just don't remember. I think this is episode 5 or 6. I don't know. Life is a blur today, because ultimately it's a little bit of today. So, WandaVision. So ultimately I had seen this episode, and it's again yet another episode where I'm basically just like, wow, this show, it's exciting. It's exciting. If by meaning it being irrelevant, then exciting it should be. Again, the only real good episode is going to be the last episode, sadly. I think. And if I'm wrong about that, and if they don't really answer anything on the very last episode, and they get to a dicey thing going on in the last episode, then ultimately I'll just be like, what was the point of this episode then? What was the point of all this? Ah! But anyways, we have an intro of this episode that I feel that I'm very familiar with. I also went into here and I was looking at okay, well, it seems that Wanda's children seem to have a costume, which ultimately I'm familiar with and know who these people will be at some point. So that's great to ultimately just see these two adults. They're not adults, they're kids that seem to be ultimately, I know full well eventually where their stories are to head to, with the exclusion of where their stories are actually going to head to, because when looking at it, they're very young, and I'm not assuming or assessing that certain characters are going to end up the way they end up. Mood point. So we end up having it to where Vision ultimately is seemingly doing some investigating work that goes into being a superhero, and it seems that Vision is actually going out of his way to do a neighborhood watch. The neighborhood that he ends up watching is a neighborhood that is kind of looking very odd and very strange, and I'm kind of really not quite understanding why this neighborhood is doing what it's doing. And also, we have it to where Quicksilver brings up a point in this episode where all of a sudden, bizarrely, how is it that ultimately there weren't as many certain kind of people here that they are now all of a sudden? I would assess that maybe Scarlet Witch had some magical ability upon that to ultimately make it so that ultimately there are certain kind of people that are here now that weren't here before. Because I'll get to that in spoilers, let's just say. We ultimately seemingly have barely a backstory of Quicksilver, but a lot of it seems kind of mixed together in some kind of other way of just ultimately saying, yeah, we can't actually cleverly write things, so we'll just make it so vague that that ultimately, if you had watched Age of Ultron, you could be confused by what they have said, or if you had watched X-Men Apocalypse or whatever the heck else, you could still be confused by whatever the heck is going on, because it rationally makes no sense, because ultimately we have it to where reasonably it's really confusing. So going into this, I thought that this episode was really just them otherwise just figuring out a way to add more things into this episode eventually. I also don't like what is to go on with Ramboa, or whatever her name is, the girl that was Geraldine. I don't like what is going on with her character in this episode, because ultimately we have it to where Darcy is talking to her, and ultimately letting her know a thing, and I'm like, ugh. Like immediately I'm like, I just think it's silly and or stupid. Some of the things that they're doing with some of the characters, to like I think there's a lot of things that just kind of feel like reasonably that we're stretching things. We're stretching a lot of things in this show, and like man, and this show is like breaking its back trying to stretch things and make things so aloof and so misunderstood, so that way they can stretch another big fat episode out of this. And like we basically only have a small number of episodes left, and we're basically going to have more questions than more answers. And again, I'm not trying to say like I want everything solved. No, I just ultimately want it to be that I want to have my time be worth my time of watching something. When looking at it, I've wasted so much time on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Agent Carter, reasonably anything that isn't a cartoon and or animated, because every single one of the Marvel cartoons are really good. The live action stuff, very vastly different. So, speaking of time, let's go into spoiler time. Let's go into knocking out this review out of the park, because at the end of the day, there's really not, again, a lot to say about these episodes. There just isn't. There's just like, well, hey, Halloween, isn't that exciting? Sure. For every other show that has always ever done a Halloween episode? Sure. So, we have it to our ultimately now in spoiler time. Spoiler time, let's do that time again to spoil the episode. So, we ultimately have it to where in the very beginning of this, we have it to where ultimately people are to get out their costumes, and ultimately we have it to where the intro of this episode feels like Malcolm in the Middle to me, where I was just expecting for somebody to say "Life is unfair" at the very end of this intro, because that's what it looked like to me. So we have it to where ultimately Wanda and Vision are walking downstairs to ultimately showcase to us their old-fashioned costumes, their old looks. We end up having it to where ultimately Wanda is to walk down to ultimately say that she is a Sokovian fortune teller, which I'm ultimately like, sure. We have it to where ultimately Vision is to walk down in his traditional garb, and he is to be said that he is a luchador or a Mexican wrestler. And I'm like, sure, okay, justify the costume. So we end up having now I have to explain who Wanda and Vision's sons really actually are, because when looking at it, I'm only going to be calling them by their superhero names. I'm not going to be calling them by Billy or Tommy, because I don't remember who is who, because ultimately I don't care about who is really who. I don't care who's Tommy. I don't care who's Billy, because those are super generic names that ultimately I do not care. So we ultimately have one son who's wearing the headband in this episode. Ultimately, that is actually Wiccan, who is a magician of sorts, and ultimately at some point in later on in his comic book life, he had been gay, and ultimately had, I believe, been in a relationship with Hulkling in the Young Avengers at some point. The Young Avengers that ultimately had Patriot, Wiccan, Hulkling, and I think somebody else in there, like a mixture of some other people in there as well. We also have it to where Quicksilver ultimately has seemingly a partner in crime. Ultimately, this character is to be called Speed. So we end up having it to where Quicksilver and Speed are basically wearing the same, almost identical costume and whatever, what have you. So we have it to where, bizarrely, so let me get this straight. So Vision and Wanda have a baby, and Wanda has a kid that has the exact same powers as Quicksilver, but it's Vision's baby. Anybody else a little confused about that? Anybody else a little baffled and confused about that? But I guess it is what it is. So we end up having it to where it seems that Quicksilver and Speed are ending up wreaking havoc all over the Halloween town, it seems, but we'll get to that. So we end up having Vision going off on his own to ultimately say that he's going to do the neighborhood watch, but that's ultimately going to be found out to be a falsehood of sorts. So we end up having it to where reasonably Quicksilver and Wanda end up going out with the kids, and Vision goes on his own to investigate, and we'll talk about that. So ultimately, I'll get to the Wanda stuff, and then ultimately I'll get to the Vision stuff, and then we'll kind of probably finish up this episode after that with all that stuff. So going into it, so we ultimately have it to where Wanda and Quicksilver are to ultimately go and stroll around into this Halloween like adventure of people getting costumes. When honestly and truly looking at this neighborhood, I can tell the costumes kind of feel like that anything that anybody found off of eBay as far as a Halloween costume quasi, like that's what everybody like just got. Like everybody just got like the cheapest costume thing that they could have possibly found for the most point for these costumes for this for Westview. So we have it to where ultimately we have it to where Quicksilver is ultimately talking to Wanda, and at some point we have it to where they reference the movie Kick-Ass, which ultimately has both Quicksilvers in that same movie simultaneously together. Because ultimately we have Wanda saying the word Kick-Ass to ultimately reference that both Quicksilvers were both in the movie Kick-Ass together as a little joke. So we end up having eventually where Quicksilver and Speed are wreaking havoc all over the neighborhood, and we have it to where Wanda is talking to a one of her neighbors that is doing the neighborhood watch, and I guess ultimately I probably could have gotten the IMDb out, but I didn't care. I really and honestly and truly didn't care. So we end up having it to where Wanda is talking to this Frankenstein who is ultimately being the neighborhood watch, and ultimately knowing full well that this is Vision's co-worker and neighbor. So we end up having it to where this Frankenstein is ultimately to mention that, hey, like it seems that people are getting their candy stolen, pumpkins smashed, and ultimately people are getting silly stringed. All the while that basically Quicksilver and Speed are doing this afterwards after this guy had said all of this, which makes actually no sense. But anyways, so we move on, and ultimately we have it to where Wanda asks this neighborhood watchman, like, well, hey, is Vision on his way to ultimately kind of investigate the neighborhood? And we have it to where this neighborhood watchman is mentioning, like, no, like, Vision isn't even doing the neighborhood watch. And so ultimately, Juan is very just like, huh, well, what is he doing then? So We end up having Quicksilver and Wanda ultimately walking off to ultimately mention kind of Quicksilver is very confused how exactly uh, Wanda and Vision had really been able to make kids, and how exactly did that happen? And ultimately, we have it to where uh, Wanda kind of has to try to confirm Quicksilver's backstory. So we end up finding out that Quicksilver ultimately had mentioned that he had been shot in a street, and then ultimately he had right after that been all of a sudden hearing the voice of Scarlet Witch ultimately to arrive at her door to just be like, hey, I'm home, kind of thing. And so ultimately we have it to maybe be that this could quite possibly be so vague that reasonably it doesn't actually fit into maybe a Avengers Age of Ultron, or it doesn't fit into the X-Men movie. Because ultimately anybody at any point in time could have gotten shot. Like ultimately this Quicksilver is not exactly confirming that he is the Quicksilver from Age of Ultron and so on and so forth, but we just have to forcibly confirm that anyways. So we ultimately have it to where bizarrely that Wanda is looking at Pedro, her brother, and ultimately she's seeing him as a zombie with bullet holes into his body, and we are ultimately to confirm that Quicksilver is actually dead, but Wanda had brought him back to life. So reasonably, it's just like so. Reasonably, what I'm thinking is happening is basically any person that Wanda ends up bringing back from the dead ultimately is to not be able to leave Westview. Like, I don't think that Wanda is going to be able to take Quicksilver or Vision out of this bubble, because if they were to leave this bubble, they would quite possibly die. Or, I think reasonably, if we're going to get Wanda and or Vision outside of this bubble, it is to only be because uh, Wanda had allowed it to just kind of be. So, reasonably, I thought that that portion of this show was kind of interesting, but when looking at it, I honestly also could care less. Because recently I'm like, yeah, they're stretching this episode like a mofo. Also, we have a commercial about Yo Magic, which honestly made no sense to me. Does the YO mean anything? No clue. Uh, Also, like, I didn't quite understand the approach to the commercial. What was that all about? Uh, what was there any kind of little Easter eggs out of this whole entire commercial besides like, hey, Scarlet uses magic, yo magic, isn't that great? Maybe Wiccan says the word yo magic or something. I don't know. Maybe yo means I in Spanish. I don't know. Um, but anyways, so speaking of, so ultimately we have it to where uh, Wiccan is ultimately talking to Wanda and ultimately mentioning that he is seeing bizarrish visions about his father ultimately getting hurt. And so ultimately that is to lead Wanda to expand the Westview bubble, and we'll get to that. So ultimately, now we have to go into the Vision journey of things. So we ultimately have it to where Vision is to go on a neighborhood watch, but not exactly around his neighborhood. So we ultimately have it to where Vision ends up going and just checking out neighborhoods that are ultimately not as close to Wanda. And so we end up having Vision quite possibly noticing that it seems like whatever portion of Westview that Wanda isn't a part of. It seems that the rest of the town is just kind of going through the motions, or ultimately just uh, kind of forced to just kind of look like they're lifelike, but they're not actually lifelike. So ultimately, what I'm assessing is that when Wanda is not a part of certain portions of town, like her, like she doesn't have as strong ability to control everybody or make them look like like Leave It to Beaver-ish, like people, so to speak, if you know what I mean. Like she doesn't have the ability to control this entire town when ultimately she is not focused on it. Ultimately, we have it to where people are to give the illusion of lifelike, but in all actuality, they are just really just cogs in a machine that ultimately isn't really working all that well in their area. It kind of feels like a Wi-Fi connection where the Wi-Fi is not as strong in that area, so you just kind of have people that are just kind of like doing the same motion like over and over again. Because ultimately, like their Wi-Fi, let's just say, is not strong in that area because Wanda isn't actually there to implement what is to go on in that portion of town. Because ultimately, we have it to where Wanda's focus is elsewhere. So we have it to where ultimately Vision is making his way through this town and trying to investigate what is all going on. And so we have it to where eventually uh, we have it to where Vision is ultimately just trying to make his way through this town, investigate and see people, and ultimately start asking people questions. Ultimately, not a lot of people have a lot of answers. And so we eventually have to where Vision ends up going to Agnes, who ultimately has some kind of witch hat on. And so ultimately we have it to where Vision ends up doing this thing where ultimately he ends up putting fingers through people's heads, and that ends up jockeying what they know about whatever. And so we end up having it to where Agnes is talking about that she had uh, gone into the wrong road or something like that, that she has gotten lost or something along those lines. So we eventually have to where Vision does his finger thing to Agnes, and so she goes like, "Oh my God, you need to help us! Like you're an Avenger! Like you need to help us!" And ultimately, Vision doesn't know what an Avenger is, and so ultimately we have it to where Agnes is kind of losing her freaking mind, and so we have it to where Vision just puts his fingers back onto Agnes, and then ultimately she ends up just eventually just driving off. So we have it to where Vision is ultimately trying to understand what quite possibly is beyond this Westview bubble that ultimately Wanda is put them in. And so we have it to where Vision is consistently walking further and further into the Westview bubble and then going even further to get out of the Westview bubble. So here is the thing now. So ultimately, we are outside the Westview bubble. So let's get into the Rambo stuff. So ultimately, we have it to where Rambo and her superior are blah blah blah, bickering back and forth about how everything is not going quite right, like how it should be, and blah 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 blah. Who cares? So it's a bunch of just bureaucratical nonsense and all kinds of blah blah bloop. But the only real vital informational portion of this is we have it to where ultimately we are having Darcy tell Rambo that, again, hey, just so you know, you're related to Carol Danvers, just so you know. Because ultimately we have to keep bringing that up to try and sell more tickets to the Captain Marvel movie, evidently, because good God, how many freaking times have we got to do that? Mother trucker! So, anyways, we have it to where Darcy is to tell Rambeau that ultimately she's probably going to become either one of two things, Spectrum or Miss Marvel at some point, because we ultimately have it. We ultimately have to tell Miss Rambeau that ultimately her midichlorians are getting different or being weird and all kinds of things, because ultimately we find out that Rambeau ultimately went from in and out of this portal repetitiously too often to where reasonably Miss Rambeau was eventually going to get superpowers. And I'm like, so in other words, she's either going to be Spectrum or she's going to be Miss Marvel. And immediately I groan at either aspect of either one of those because I'm like, yeah, I really just don't care what they do with this character. To be brutally honest, like and I think because the reason why I don't care is the way that they are really writing her in to have superpowers now, and I think that that is dumb. She could have had superpowers this entire time, and maybe they should have given her a movie to explain why she got that superpowers afterwards. Do it the Captain Marvel way, where you have to go back in time before Geraldine had gotten blipped and had already had superpowers, and or maybe it's just the fact that like what are they gonna do now? Are they gonna mention that Rambo is now a mutant instead of her being a inhuman? That's kind of garbage. It's a little garbage. It's a little sweet, delicious garbage that ultimately I will not enjoy. So we ultimately have it to where all the police force are ultimately going and noticing that Vision is climbing his way out of the bubble. But it seems like pieces of Vision are getting sucked back into the vortex of the Westview. Because, again, Vision is not a real boy, meaning that he's not actually a real live being. And so, hence why immediately when Vision, all of his pieces were going back and being sucked back into the bubble, it's because Vision actually isn't alive. So, we forcibly have to have it to where Wiccan is telling Scarlet Witch that ultimately, like, hey, like, Dad's dying, I guess. Letting you know. I'll send the tweet as well, okay? So we end up having it to where reasonably Wanda goes out and expands the Westview bubble to way bigger than what it actually is. And so we have all these sword people just scrambling, just going, oh my god, I have to run away from this. We end up having Darcy handcuffed to some vehicle, and ultimately I'm assuming that Darcy's going to get sucked into the Scarlet Witch Leave to Beaver camp, if you know what I mean. And so we're going to have all kinds of people that ultimately are going to get sucked into the Westview, and then ultimately they're going to have to portray whoever they have to be for these episodes. It would have been awesome if ultimately we would have found out that Darcy would have had some superpower of sorts, but ultimately I guess we'll never know. Is Darcy going to have a superpower now that she was sucked into the Westview? Is any of the sword people gonna all have superpowers now because they were sucked into Westview? Is that what's gonna happen now? Is that what we're all gonna do? So yeah, reasonably that's all I have real true relevance of really what to talk about in this episode because really, what am I gonna talk about? Wiccan and Speed ultimately eating a bowl of cereal and talking about things? Who cares? Am I gonna talk about really what is to end up with any other of these people? I honestly don't know. I'm honestly thinking that everybody's gonna either turn into a Wanda zombie, or they're gonna end up turning into mutants. And so everybody's gonna everyone's gonna turn into being a mutant, and then Wanda is gonna just control all of them. And so we're just gonna have an entire town full of mutants. And eventually we're gonna have Darcy go back to Thor: Love and Thunder and be a mutant, and that's gonna be pretty sweet. And that's what I'm thinking is going to happen. Scarlet Witch is going to turn everybody into mutants, and that's going to be great. She's going to be just like her father. She is going to pull off the Statue of Liberty maneuver, and that's what's going to happen in this movie, or in this show, I mean, is Wanda is going to be the Statue of Liberty girl, and ultimately she's going to turn everybody into freaks. And then ultimately, those mutants are all eventually probably either going to, one, die off, or two, quite possibly be able to figure out how to either come up with some equivalent of figuring out how to like either call these characters mutants or Inhumans or whatever the heck that they're going to call them, because ultimately Miss Marvel is actually a Inhuman. So are they going to retcon that? That ultimately, oh no, Miss Marvel is actually just a mutant. Isn't that great? No. Um, if anything, I've heard word that there could quite possibly be Magneto on the show, or there could quite possibly be any number of uh, characters that they're going to add via the X Men universe in this show. I think if they're going to add anybody into the X Men universe, I think forcibly one, they're probably going to have to add Beast, because there's a Marvel Sword show that's going on, which ultimately I'm assuming has Beast in it. So I'm also assuming that probably at some point they're probably going to have to add Magneto to this show, because ultimately we have Quicksilver again, we have Wanda in here again, and so ultimately now we have to have it to where in reasonably the X-Men movie that Quicksilver had known that Magneto is his father, and so why not just push that whole relationship into this show? Because reasonably, I think that's what you're going to have to do anyways. Because when really reasonably looking at it, it's just like, well, um, there always has to be some kind of X-Men story that has Magneto in it, and when looking at it, um, like it's kind of always a no-brainer to go the Magneto route for every single freaking thing that they do in here. But anyways, so yeah, I don't know. I'm not really interested in any of the other episodes, but the last one. So if anything, like again, I'm willing to watch the rest of the show just to see where it goes. But I also, speaking of going, I can't wait till one, this show is done, and to ultimately see what they're going to do with Falcon and Winter Soldier, because that seems to have a lot more going on into it than this show does. Uh, but then also, I'm thinking about going, so I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.